You know most of this already. As the designated sexual assault response program for Indiana, we support rape crisis centers, sexual assault response teams. But also, what you may not know is that we co chair the Indiana Protection for Abused and Trafficked Humans Task Force with the U.S. Attorney's Office for the Southern District of Indiana. We call it IPATH for short, and that is our statewide anti trafficking task force. We've been doing that. The task force has been around since about 2005, but we've been the co chair since 2017. So, just a little bit about me. I am a licensed attorney in both Illinois and Indiana. I don't currently practice, but as you can see here, I've had a lot of different direct legal roles over the years. I started out doing child abuse and neglect cases. I've done adult guardianships, legal aid. Um, when I got into the anti-trafficking field, I was a regional coalition coordinator, and now I actually am the task force coordinator for IPATH, in addition to doing training and technical assistance in my current role at ICASA HT. So, a lot of times when we are doing training around trafficking, people tend to think of child victims and adult victims as two separate populations who are completely different, and they, get into exploitive situations differently and they struggle differently. And while there are some differences, the reality is that adult victims are often child victims that didn't get identified or receive help. Polaris, which runs the National Human Trafficking Hotline, in January of last year, put out a survey of almost 500 survivors that they talked to, and 96% of them said they had experienced childhood abuse, whether it was sexual, physical, or emotional. So that should hopefully kind of help you shift how you think of adult victims, which is who we're going to be talking about today, since that's primarily who sexual assault response teams work with. And just to give you some idea of what this looks like and why I'm so passionate about training around this issue with SARTs. Um, a number of years ago, before I got into this field, I was a court appointed special advocate in Marion County, and I was working with a sibling group of three girls who were living at home with their mom under an order of protection. The case had come into the system because mom's boyfriend had sexually abused two of them. And so she agreed to move them out of his apartment and engage in services in a no contact order. So one of the visits when I was out to one of my monthly visits when I was out to interview the girls, I was speaking with the oldest, who was 15 at the time, and just had a really difficult time engaging her. She was very engaged with her Facebook on her phone, which she seemed very intent on looking at that and seemed nervous to even like put it down for a minute. So that was kind of odd in and of itself. But after I wrapped up my visit, I was heading out to my car, and mom followed me outside, and she said, um, I don't know what to do with her. And she was referring to the oldest daughter. I was really upset. The other morning, I caught her coming in at 4 o'clock in the morning. She apparently left in the middle of the night. They got in a huge argument, and um, when mom told her there was going to be stricter rules in the home, the daughter said, I don't have to listen to you. I have a man who can take care of me, and mentioned a guy that she had met at the local McDonald's down the street. That in itself should have screamed human trafficking. Unfortunately, this was before there really was any training or education out there. And so I scrambled to do an emergency meeting with DCS and try to figure out how to address that. And we put more services in place, and there is a new emergency service plan. But after I no longer had that role, I looked back and could see there were so many red flags in that case. that we all completely missed. And I thought to myself, and the other thing that mom had mentioned to me right before I left that night was, and she just said it very kind of mumbled it, kind of vague. That sort of thing happened to me at her age too. So as I have thought about it over the years, I thought, well, that's, obviously generational. It did not occur to me until several years after the initial realization that what I was seeing with mom present day, we couldn't ever seem to verify where she worked. Like she would give these numbers and these names of businesses where nobody would ever answer the phone. She would wind up in the ER a lot, and she'd always have a different vague explanation for what happened to her. The likelihood is that mom was probably being trafficked at the time as well. So this is why I'm so passionate about helping people understand when you're coming across adults what really might be happening in the background. And why do we focus on sexual assault response teams? The biggest piece is because you already have that collaborative multidisciplinary response. Human trafficking is not something that one agency can tackle by itself. You really have to have a prosecutor and law enforcement and victim services and advocate and healthcare providers at the table to address it together. And so you all are in a position to identify these cases, respond, and then also raise the community awareness of the issue. Really quick before we get to the objectives, I want to say a word about the terms victim versus survivor. So, when I'm using the word victim, I'm really referring to situations where somebody's not identified yet, particularly when we're talking about legal statutes, or if we're talking about identification for DCS purposes. That's who we refer to as a victim. However, once somebody is identified and they're in services, we tend to refer to them as a survivor because it's a strength-based way of recognizing how resilient they are and the things that they have overcome. All right, so our objectives today, we're going to be looking at Indiana law, federal law as well, some statistics in Indiana and current trends, going to help you understand the barriers to identifying and engaging with adult victims and how to overcome those barriers with a victim-centered response. Going to learn about the overlap between sexual assault and human trafficking and the role of ASART, and then talk about some collaborative resources in our state. All right, so federal law, if you haven't seen these before, these are the definitions for sex trafficking and labor trafficking. I always tell people don't feel like you need to memorize the entire paragraph definition. We have an easier way of breaking that down, but I do want to highlight a few things. So if you look at the sex trafficking definition, that recruitment, harboring, transporting, providing, obtaining, patronizing, or soliciting somebody for the purpose of a commercial sex act, which is induced by force, fraud, or coercion, or which the person induced to perform the act has not attained the age of 18. What that last piece means, if somebody is a minor and they're involved in commercial sex, under the law, they're automatically considered a human trafficking victim, whether or not you can show that force, fraud, or coercion. That's really important, especially because both youth and adult victims, most of the time, do not self identify as a victim. Also, when we say commercial sex act, traditionally we tend to think of an exchange of sex for money, but it's an exchange of sex for anything of value. So that can be money, but it could also be food, clothes, shelter, drugs is a very common one. Labor trafficking, you see a lot of those same pieces to obtain somebody for labor services, again, through that force, fraud, or coercion, but you do have to prove those means that force, fraud, or coercion in both cases of minors and adults. So this is the AMP model. It's an easier way to break down those elements. So particularly if you're a prosecutor and you're trying to figure out, do you have the pieces there? You're looking for one of those actions by one of those means for one of those purposes. And again, if we're talking about a minor, you do not have to show that force, fraud, or coercion, although very often those things, one or more, are actually present. And please feel free to stop me as we go along if I'm moving a little too fast. I do want to make sure that we get everything in today, but if you have a question, just pop it in the chat and Marissa can give me a shout out. Okay, so reasonable person standard for forced labor in federal law. I like to highlight this because this is something that was changed in federal law. So the Trafficking Victims Protection Act was passed in 2000. That's the federal law on human trafficking. But this was a change that was made in 2008. If we're talking about somebody who's in a labor trafficking situation and we're trying to figure out were they coerced through serious harm or threats of harm to the point where they felt like they physically could not leave. We have to look at it with an objective, reasonable person standard of the same background and same circumstances. So, for instance, if there's an employer who is saying to an individual, um, you're never going to see your family again if you don't do this, or I'm not going to give you your ID back, or you have this huge debt to pay off and you can't leave until you pay it off. You and I might look at the circumstances and think that's ridiculous. I'm out of here. I don't have to stick around for that. I'm going to report him to somebody. However, if we're talking about an individual who has come here from another country, maybe they don't speak English, they don't have any support network, they have no other means of supporting their family, they don't know what their rights are, um, that's very different, and they are likely to feel like they're stuck in that situation. So they definitely started to identify more cases once they changed the standard. All right, so Indiana law, these are our criminal offenses around human trafficking. They have a lot of the same pieces and parts as the federal law, just broken down into these separate offenses. Human trafficking is actually our statute that holds buyers of commercial sex accountable. All right, really important to know that in addition to other crime victim rights, human trafficking victims have additional rights under our state law. So they may not be detained in a facility that's not appropriate to their crime victim status. They may not be jailed, fined, or otherwise penalized for having been the victim of the offense. They shall be provided protection if the victim's safety is at risk. So if you actually go into the statute and look at the specific wording, this is referring to law enforcement providing this protection. Very often victims are actively being threatened and intimidated when they're initially identified. So whether it's threats to them personally or being told if you cooperate with law enforcement or if you tell people what's happening, I'm going to kill your family members. So we recognize in our state law, it's really important to address that piece of their victimization. And then this final bullet point is for law enforcement. The law enforcement officer, the Declaration of Law Enforcement Officer form is a federal form that helps survivors pursue a T visa, which is specific to trafficking victims if they're a foreign national. And our state law actually requires that law enforcement agencies provide this to an alleged victim unless they make a determination that it's not appropriate for some reason, and then they have to provide notice to the victim as to why it's not appropriate. All right. And a final piece here, really important to know that restitution is actually mandatory in human trafficking cases. So I know it's discretionary with other types of crime, but in federal and state law, it is mandatory in human trafficking cases. Just because there's so much that has been taken from individuals who've been through exploitation, and this is an attempt to make them whole. Unfortunately, in our state law, it's the same restitution that other crime victims would be entitled to, and it's a lot more limited than it would be in federal cases, but really important to make sure that they still get restitution in a criminal case. And this one's for law enforcement. If you are law enforcement or you have law enforcement partners who don't know this, starting in July of 2022, so 2 years ago, there's a requirement that they report all human trafficking investigations to the Attorney General's office, not more than 30 days after beginning an investigation. And there's a link that I've put at the bottom where they can do those reports online. So if you can share that with your law enforcement partners, that would be great. I don't know that this is common knowledge necessarily with local law enforcement agencies, and we definitely want to be able to start collecting more data and information on these cases. All right, so most people want to know, one of the first questions is how much does it actually happen here in Indiana? And it's when we talk about data on human trafficking, this is really a nuanced question because we don't have a great way for collecting it. So, the National Human Trafficking Hotline takes calls from all 50 states. And since they started keeping track of numbers in 2007 through 2021, which was the last time they put out their current statistics, they identified over 1,000 cases originating in Indiana with over 2,300 victims. But the reality is, we know this is only a small portion of what's really out there. We do not have any unified state database. Uh, most states don't have their own state hotline for these cases. There are a handful that do. I think I just saw recently, I believe it was maybe Ohio that launched theirs a couple of weeks ago. I'm hoping that we can get there at some point, but we're definitely not there yet. And so we very often, when we're trying to figure out how much we're dealing with this, we have to look at those national hotline numbers or talk to our service partners that individually collect numbers on how many clients that they're serving. Um, Calls to the national hotline aren't mandatory. So only the people, oops, let's go back, only the people who know about the hotline and are aware of it and actually calling it, right, are being counted. And then if we're talking about minors, because human trafficking is considered child abuse in Indiana, those calls are a mandatory call to the DCS hotline. And so they have their own separate numbers. And so it's a lot of just at this point, us trying to cobble together different pieces and different numbers to get some sense of where we're at. All right, so here's some cases in Indiana involving adult victims. So you have an idea of what these prosecutions involve. Um, by and large, if so, most states don't have tons of prosecutions. Indiana's not alone on that level, but if you do look at the prosecutions that we have done, most of them are around minors, and I'll kind of come to why that is in a little bit. But you can see for these cases, state of Indiana versus Chris Smiley. That was our first state prosecution in Indiana involving a 19-year-old who was working in a strip club and forced into prostitution to pay off drug debts for others. US versus James Young and Raheem Simmons, that was 2018. The defendants were trafficking minors and adults out of a hotel on Indianapolis's east side and advertising the victims through online sex forums. That third one there, both again, minors and adults were coerced into prostitution through two houses on Indianapolis's west side that supported a drug operation. And then that US versus Rita law in 2020, defendant forced multiple foreign-born victims into providing commercial sex acts through massage parlors. Illicit massage parlors are a large national conversation right now, if you don't already know this. Every state has numerous establishments like this, and this is not to say that every massage parlor is illicit, but obviously the ones who are selling commercial sex are. And so it's been a struggle for both service providers and law enforcement to figure out how to tackle these cases because very often the victims are Asian women, usually from China or Korea. Um, they, don't have any supports here in the US. There's the language barrier. We don't have any culturally appropriate services for them in Indiana. And so while law enforcement in recent years has done a good job really trying to crack down on these establishments, if we do get any of the women to leave, we don't have a lot to offer. And so again, it's a national conversation we've been having and trying to connect with people in other states to figure out how do we do a better job of addressing those cases. All right, so human trafficking overlaps with a lot of other societal issues because basically traffickers prey on people that are struggling and have vulnerabilities. So we see it overlapping with domestic violence, anyone who's a recent immigrant, lack of resources, substance abuse. This is a huge one. We see so much overlap in cases where people also have an addiction. Very often it's used as a means of initially grooming and recruiting them, where the trafficker starts out as somebody's dealer. And then once they have them hooked, they say, you're not getting your next fix until you start making some money for me. And the cycle just spirals from there. And then sexual assault definitely falls in the category of individuals who are vulnerable. So when we talk about sex trafficking and labor trafficking, it's really easy to think that sexual assault, sexual violence only happens in sex trafficking, which, because it's called sex trafficking, that obviously makes sense. But we do see that it's very often present in forced marriage, which is also considered trafficking in Indiana, as well as labor trafficking cases. So, that might look like victims being raped or other types of sexual assault because they're not cooperating with what they're told to do. It's a form of punishment, or saying, look what I just did to this other employee. I'm going to do it to you if you don't do what you're told. And so, um, this quote from the Freedom Network, who does a lot of work on the national level around this issue. In all of these situations, it's important to remember that no one agrees to be sexually assaulted or trafficked despite appearances. So we'll talk about that commercial sex industry piece in a minute. So there are a number of similarities between sexual assault and human trafficking cases. Anyone can be a victim. So it's not specific to one race or gender or nationality or sexual orientation. They both have wide-ranging needs. Identification can be difficult in both types of cases because of stigma and victim blaming, and perpetrators use power and control in both cases. But there are some very specific differences if we're talking about a human trafficking case. For those, we're not talking about one instance or, one perpetrator. Very often it's multiple perpetrators and the abuse is ongoing. There can be multiple offenses overlapping. So you might have trafficking along with sexual assault, along with domestic violence. If we're talking about foreign nationals, there can be that visa fraud mixed in as well. That abuse and control is used for a purpose of forced labor, commercial sexual exploitation, and then frequently there's forced criminal activity in human trafficking cases. So traffickers very often will coerce their victims into committing crimes during the course of their exploitation. Um, we have found that with a lot of adult survivors, they have long criminal records and it may not show anything related to human trafficking. So you may not be thinking about that, but it could be prostitution charges, drug charges, weapons charges, theft charges. And having those criminal records prevents them from getting jobs, it prevents them from getting housing, and then it leaves them open to being vulnerable and continual exploitation. So really important when you're coming across those individuals that have those records, you're seeing those things in their background, to take another look and think about, is there something else going on there? Vulnerable adult populations, again, as I tell people all the time, and I said at the beginning, very often we're talking about the children that weren't identified and now they are adults. So that personal or family history of substance use, personal or family history of abuse and violence, mental illness, recent migration, individuals with disabilities, lack of resources, incarcerated individuals, and then that history of being trafficked as a minor. Okay, so this is likely to look familiar to many of you if you have done any work around domestic violence or been in that field. This is the power and control wheel that was originally developed within that context. And then Polaris, which again runs the National Human Trafficking Hotline, um, they adapted that for use in the trafficking field because we recognize so many of these same elements are present. You see those, when you're asking, why doesn't somebody identify, why don't they leave their situation? Very similar to a battered spouse. They're being isolated. There's that emotional abuse. There can be coercion and threats, economic abuse. They have no control over any finances, sexual abuse, telling them it's their fault or minimizing or making light of what's happening to them. Very often, it's not just one of these things, it's multiples of these things. And then we actually have what I call a legal barrier to identifying adult victims. And it's that means piece. If you remember when I was talking about the definitions at the beginning, that force, fraud, or coercion does not need to be proven for minors, but it does in the case of adults. And so it's so tricky because you can have somebody who's 17 and, you know, 364 days old, right? And so they're involved in commercial sex. You can look at that and say they're a minor. They're automatically considered a human trafficking victim. The very next day on their birthday, they're 18. They're in the exact same circumstances, but now you have to prove one of these things. And if they're not saying that they're a victim, they don't recognize they're a victim, they're likely not telling you these things to show that they are. And this is where it makes it really tricky. I have heard there's some um, talk on the national level to change at least federal law to remove that requirement for both adults and minors. Okay. And then this last one is what I call bias barriers. And it's just encouraging you to think about how we perceive people. So maybe you're coming across somebody who, you know, they're working with a service provider, or you're seeing them out in the street, or law enforcement comes across them and they're identified as a prostitute. Just to be clear, not every adult in prostitution is a human trafficking victim. If they're doing that on their own and there's no third party, that's prostitution. However, this particular study found that 50% of first-time arrestees for prostitution actually met the federal definition as victims of human trafficking. When I've talked to service providers that work with this population, they said it's much closer to 100%. All right, so drug addict. This is, if you're in a healthcare setting, again, law enforcement, maybe this is someone who, is referred to as the frequent flyer. They're constantly showing up high and disheveled, and it seems like they're constantly struggling, and this is how they're labeled. But we do know that the majority of survivors of trafficking have used alcohol, drugs, or both during their captivity, and some have been forced. They've had substance use forced on them during their experience. I've heard multiple survivors say over the years that you cannot um, go through the constant assault and rape and violence on a daily basis with multiple strangers in your right mind. It's a coping mechanism to help them get through that really complex trauma. And then finally, we've all heard talk about illegal immigrants, immigration at the southern border, and it's really easy when foreign nationals are new to the country, thinking of them in that context. But a study actually came out a number of years ago that 71% of labor trafficking victims identified in the US actually came in legally. So, what very often happens in those cases, somebody here in the US will, tell somebody in another country, we have this great job for you. You can make good money. You'll get training. You could support your family back home. I'll help you get your paperwork. So they help them get a work visa. So the person thinks they're doing the right thing. They actually come in legally with a work visa. And at the point they get here, the trafficker takes away the visa. They take away any other identification paperwork. So now the person can't show who they are. They can't stay in status on their visa. They're threatened with arrest and deportation and all kinds of other things. And then they feel like they're stuck. So just some things to keep in mind when you're coming across some of those marginalized populations that appear to be in one category and there actually might be something else going on. Okay. So Polaris did this report. This was in 2018, and they took a look at different industries to figure out what are the on ramps, what are the ways people get, come into contact with different industries or different sectors, and what are the ways that we can help them out of it. And so a number of survivors contributed to this report and talked about ways that systems had missed them. So this particular one came through a hospital, and she said, I had frequent contact with healthcare workers just through different incidents from becoming injured. I was beat up in a hotel room, so I went to a hospital. My cheekbone was fractured, and the nurse was just awful to me, treated me less than human. It was because of the commercial sex lifestyle. That was the thing. So instead of receiving compassionate care, they didn't even give me pain medication. It was just about getting me out of their hospital. And if you read through this particular report, there are a lot of quotes like that, unfortunately. So you think about this as likely somebody who was labeled as a prostitute. And that's, they were, because prostitution is a crime, they were treated like a criminal. And that's not what was actually going on for them. Okay, so before we get into the victim-centered response, I'm going to pause here because I want to ask folks, as you're hearing this information and thinking about this, how many of you have actually worked a trafficking case, or you think after hearing this that you may have come across them? And Marissa, you can let me know if folks put stuff in the chat.
Sure, we don't have anything coming through yet. It's loading for me, but you folks, you can react or raise your hand or drop anything in the chat if you would like.
I always tell people, similar to how, I didn't realize how, looking back, how many cases we had missed when I worked in the child welfare system, because again, this training wasn't out there. We weren't talking about trafficking. It's hard when you kind of look back and think, oh gosh, it was that case and that case and that case. And I've had those reactions from law enforcement, from healthcare providers, which is pretty
Karen,
common. Yeah.
we have one person. I think she has unmuted Angela.
Yeah. Go ahead.
Hi, this is Angie Siski. I work for Family Service Association in Howard County. I had to step away for a minute, but when I came back, I think you asked the question if our program, if we have been working with human trafficking victims.
Yeah.
What we're seeing in our community, most of the referrals we get are young ladies that are in homeless situations, and they meet this guy, and he's like, okay, you can come stay with me, but it's an exchange for sex. And so that's what we run into in our community the most. as far as human trafficking victims so far. But I feel like there's probably a whole lot more out there that just aren't identified yet.
Yeah. No, thank you for sharing that. That is absolutely um a, you know, a scenario where we see it in. If we're talking about kind of getting back to those societal issues, homelessness is a huge one. And if you think about, you know, commercial sex, and this is where it gets tricky. If we're talking about a 17-year-old and they're trading sex for a place to stay, it's considered human trafficking. Once they're an adult, unless there's that force, fraud, or coercion, um, that's much harder to prove. And so, looking at like if you're a prosecutor maybe and you're working with law enforcement around something like that, looking to see is there evidence that, the person said, well, um, I'm going to get rid of all your things and lock you out tonight unless you have sex with me. That I think would fall in the coercion category, right? So you still, even if it's not like that third party thing, if you can find those pieces, you still may be able to prove that it's trafficking.
Thanks for that clarification.
Yeah, no, thank you for bringing that up. Anyone else seeing specific types of situations in their individual communities or think they may be seeing it?
Yes, Karen, we have two um, two comments here. One
Mhm.
from Katie Madden. She says, I used to work at True Harbor in Newcastle, a facility for youth survivors of human trafficking, but I've not come across any cases in my current position.
Okay.
And then one from Alexa Reed. Our county has had maybe one investigation in my 3 years of being here. No charges following that investigation. It is interesting because over the last few weeks, it was just brought to our prosecutor's attention. Our officers may not be recognizing the subtle signs of human trafficking. Currently working to equip law enforcement with the ability to identify signs. You have thoughts on that, Karen? I feel like you will.
Yeah, no. Yeah, thank you so much well, thank you both for sharing those thoughts. Alexa, what area do you work in? Like what region or what county? If you can unmute or put that in the chat, either one.
I'm currently in Adams County, so our main city here is Decatur, but it's kind of the rural Geneva Bern area as
Yeah.
well.
Yeah. So that doesn't surprise me. And that's probably going to be what most people would say, especially in the more rural areas. Um, Getting law enforcement up to speed has been one of our biggest struggles over the years. It is mandatory for them to get training on human trafficking, but there's two issues. One, the mandate doesn't really describe who they should get it from or how they should get it. They do have requirements that should be included in trainings, but a lot of times they'll get like a 1 hour that's lumped in with other subjects that they need to know for their yearly, mandatory training. So they don't get a full overview like this to really understand the issue. But the other thing that we've come across a lot, there's a number of departments who are definitely open to training and they want to do that and learn more about it. But because so many of them are under-resourced and have, staff that's really pressed for time, it's difficult to actually schedule something with them where we can get all of their staff trained. So, for instance, we'll be talking about Grant County at the end of this presentation. They have some fantastic law enforcement there that are really engaged on this issue, but trying to schedule training for their entire department has been difficult because of that, that being under resourced and just having so many other things they have to address. But I would say if you have law enforcement that wants to learn more, definitely let's connect. On the state task force, we have a law enforcement coordinator of our operations who he's a fantastic resource. Even if folks don't have time for training, he's always happy to offer technical assistance and troubleshoot and things like that. So even if we can take those small steps to get them connected. And something that we have noticed, like in Grant County, when we really started having the conversations around trafficking and what it looked like and who needed to be involved to address it, even those who hadn't had the training yet started recognizing cases, and it made a difference. So yeah, I really appreciate you sharing that. Thank you.
And Karen, we have one more, which I feel like is kind of the same, similar to the conversation we were just having.
Yeah.
Olivia Minnick, covering Fountain and Warren, says, here in our rural area, we have not had many HT cases until recently. In the last 2 months, we've had a few survivors come forward. Our team is realizing we are not as trained as we need to be and working towards this.
Thank you for sharing that. Yeah, so we're going to cover some training resources at the end that can help you all with that. The rural areas are tricky in that, yes, most of the cases we identify are in the more urban areas, but part of the reason for that is because there's more resources and more service providers that can identify cases. So we don't think that it's not happening in rural areas. It's more that there aren't as many resources that are engaging with those populations. And so anything we can do to support you and collaborate on that, we would be happy to do. Thank you for sharing that. Okay, so getting into the victim-centered response. This is from the Federal Office for Victims of Crime Training and Technical Assistance Center. Essentially, this is the victim-centered response is taking into account the victim's wishes, their safety, and their well-being in all matters and procedures. So you're putting the victim literally in the center of everything that you're doing, whether you're law enforcement, whether you're a service provider, whether you're a healthcare provider. You want to use this lens as your approach. So, what that looks like in practice when you're first encountering somebody where you suspect it, or maybe they've just been identified, building trust and rapport is huge with this population. They can be very mistrustful because of all of the trauma and the people who have lied to them and being criminalized, just all those different issues. It's really hard for them to trust people, especially systems related people. So taking that non-judgmental and respectful approach like you would with any other human being goes a long way. For adults, especially listening to what they say they need versus what you think they need. And this is a tough one. And I even have to remind myself of this sometimes when we're working on a case, we think, oh, well, they obviously need X, Y, and Z. But in the moment, that's not what they're asking for, what they want. And so unless we're, talking about somebody who's an endangered adult and has, an incapacity, um, adults get to make their own choices like any other adult and decide what's best for them. And they're the expert of their situation. Asking them what justice means to them, giving them choices is huge. So when I've done training for law enforcement in the past, we always explain somebody who's been exploited has all their choices taken away from them. They're told what work they're going to be doing, where they can sleep, when they can eat, what their name is going to be, when they can speak or not speak. And so encountering somebody who even gives them small choices, such as, do you need a minute before, I ask a few questions? Would you like to sit over here or do you feel more comfortable over here? Would you like a glass of water? I mean, they sound like such minor things, but somebody actually asking what they want has not happened to them for so long that can make a huge difference and go a long way. Cultural sensitivity and humility. We are coming across more and more foreign national populations that are at risk and we're finding are being trafficked in Indiana. We're seeing a lot of Guatemalan foreign nationals, Haitians, Mexicans in the agricultural field, again, Asian women and the illicit massage parlors. And so that means really taking the time to recognize that their cultural background may be very different from ours and being willing to learn and recognizing, we there's a lot there that we don't know, and we want to be respectful of that. And then being trauma informed always. Um, when we're talking about service provision, safety planning and immediate needs are always the primary go-to. Do they have housing? Do they have safe housing? Do they have food? Do they have childcare? On the housing front, so Marissa Hopstack, my colleague, is on today. She's our anti-trafficking special projects coordinator. She's worked with our state task force to create a housing guide for task force service providers and kind of a process for how do we find that housing, because it's such a gap in Indiana. We don't have residential facilities for, for adults all over the state. Many times we don't even have shelters that are an option. And so how do we figure out making sure they're safe but do have housing? Always connecting them with a victim advocate. That's probably the best thing that prosecutors and law enforcement can do, is make sure that this population is connected with a victim advocate, as they're much more likely to at some point cooperate with an investigation if they feel like they're being supported and those needs are being met. And then this last one, connect them with a peer mentor. And I put in parentheses if possible, because that's not something that can be found in every community, but we do have service providers, most of them in central Indiana, that are either founded by a survivor, they have survivors working there. Grit into Grace, Unconditional are a couple of them. And so, Grace Horizon, they have some fantastic mentors in those programs. And it helps a survivor feel safe, that they can talk to somebody who understands what they've been through. All right, prosecutors, statutes of limitations. The reason I put this here is because if we're talking about an adult victim who does not initially self-identify, they don't recognize what they've been through is a crime, they mistrustful of systems, it's difficult to engage them, it can take a while to get that process going, right? And so it helps to know what those statutes of limitations are. So even if somebody is not saying right away, I'm a human trafficking victim, or yes, I want to cooperate immediately with a law enforcement investigation, maybe they don't immediately, but with the help of an advocate and getting those needs met, they want to do that. There may still be time to pursue these different charges. Okay, so red flag examples. I would say examples because there's no one list, of the no definitive list of red flags for human trafficking, because there can be so many different things. These are some of the things to look for. With the caveat, we're really shifting in this field to look more, take a whole person approach instead of just looking for red flags. And what I mean by that, if you think about kind of when I was talking about biases and thinking about what really might be going on in somebody's background, taking the time, especially if you're a service provider or you're a law enforcement officer investigating something that appears to be one crime when it could be something else, having more context around their story makes a huge difference versus just knowing these red flags, but these can definitely help. So those signs of abuse or trauma, if we're in the healthcare setting, it can be, multiple STIs. I don't think I have it on here, but multiple pregnancies or abortions, particularly at a young age, injuries, bruises, burns in different stages of healing, work-related injuries. We're talking about labor trafficking, not knowing, an individual not knowing where they are because they've been frequently relocated. That's a huge red flag. If they're an adult, someone else has control over their identity documents or their visa, also a huge red flag. Accompanied by someone who may seem controlling. The possession, so this one we actually changed, and I thought I had changed this, but I did not. Possession of multiple cell phones, hotel room keys. Those are big ones. The marbles and poker chips, we had started including that a number of years ago. I think it was in southern Indiana, where they were seeing in casinos that those items were being used in cases involving trafficking. So I don't know that we would see that for the most part and other situations, but definitely multiple cell phones is a big one. Engaged in commercial sex, obviously, residing in degraded, unsuitable living conditions. I will say if we're, a lot of labor trafficking cases, what we see is a large group of foreign nationals being transported by somebody to their workplace. They're all living in one place. Um, maybe they're working at a restaurant and they're all living in the back of the restaurant, or wherever they're being housed, there's a bunch of mattresses on the floor and no other personal belongings. And it's clearly not suitable for a large group of people. Right. So for reporting, again, if we're talking about a minor and it's suspected, um, that's a mandatory call to the DCS hotline. And this is true if you are working with DCS partners or you are DCS on this call today, um, even if the case is already in the system for something else, and then human trafficking is suspected, that warrants another call to the hotline. And it's really important when you call to say that you suspect human trafficking. The reason for that is because they have a different process they follow for those cases than other abuse and neglect cases, and you don't want it to fall through the cracks just because maybe the hotline worker didn't recognize from what you were telling them that that might be at issue. And then for adults, even if let's say you're coming across somebody as law enforcement or service provider where they don't want help right now, you can still give them, in addition to any local service providers, you can still give them the number for the National Human Trafficking Hotline, which can connect them to resources. This is not meant to be a law enforcement tip line, which a lot of people are under that mistaken assumption. If it's an immediate safety issue or a child is involved, they will definitely reach out to law enforcement and or the local DCS office. But their main goal is to connect victims and survivors with resources. And they cover over 200 languages, which is super helpful given the amount of foreign nationals that we are coming across. Okay, so IPATH, this is a quick breakdown of, what our human trafficking task force looks like. So you can see a lot of pieces and parts. In the middle there, you have our core, which is the core leadership. So again, our office co-chairs the task force with the U.S. Attorney's Office for the Southern District of Indiana. And then we have representatives from the Attorney General's Office, DCS, and several lived experience experts, which any efforts that we do, whether as an agency or a task force, should always include survivors because they are the ultimate experts in this field. So internally, we have a victim services committee with providers all over the state, a labor trafficking specific committee that just does outreach and education, and then law enforcement operations. Those darker blue circles are external coalitions or smaller task forces in the state. And the reason they're included in the graphic is because they're also all members of the state task force. So you can see we have Johnson County, they have their own task force. Anti-Trafficking Network of Northeast Indiana, which is based in Allen County and serves that area. Southern Indiana Human Trafficking Coalition, which is like Clark and surrounding counties, and then Southwest Indiana Regional Coalition, which is based in Vanderburgh and serves surrounding counties. Really important to know that there are additional coalitions that are in the process of forming or are up and running and probably will be joining the task force soon in some other areas, including the Lake County area. There's one in Wabash Valley, so kind of around Vigo County. And I believe one, I'm trying to think, it might be the Columbus area. So we've had a lot of great movement in the state the past couple of years with these efforts getting up and running. But the goal is really to have this, even though every community, whether it's rural or urban or, they're seeing different types of trafficking, they have different issues and resources. We still want everybody to have a unified approach with best practices and access to resources. Okay, so what's next? The biggest thing for starts is looking at whether individual agencies on your team have had training around trafficking. So I know a couple of you mentioned that's something you definitely need some help with, and I'll show you a resource for that in a minute. And then looking at um, the possibility of adding human trafficking protocol to existing SART protocol, and looking around to see, are there other partners that you would need at the table you don't currently have? So interpreters, um, service providers like the Indiana Trafficking Victims Assistance Program that can specifically connect you with providers that work with trafficking survivors, and then additional law enforcement partners. And I'll show you kind of what those pieces look like in a second. Okay, so I'm gonna review with you really quick the protocol that we helped Grant County create. But before we go over that, I want to make sure that we get our survey in because we do need feedback for grant purposes. So if you all can take a couple of minutes to scan this on your phone and take the survey, I would really appreciate it. And then we'll dive into the Grant County protocol. And please let me know in the chat or unmute if you have any questions in the meantime. And also let me know if you have any issues with the QR code. Marissa, do you want to give it a try too, just to double check it?
Yeah, I can.
Okay, thanks.
Yep, looks good.
All right. We've had all kinds of fun issues trying to incorporate QR codes in our presentation. So always good to have the double check. Thank you. Okay, while everyone is hopefully taking the survey, I'm going to exit this screen to pull up the Grant County protocol. So if you haven't accessed the survey yet, can you just jump in and let me know? Otherwise, I'll go ahead and exit out of this. Oops, so stop sharing that. Um, Give you all another minute to get through the survey. If people can maybe just type done in the chat once they're finished with the survey, that way I know that I'm covering everybody and we can move on.
All right, we've got a few dones rolling in here.
Thank you so much. I really appreciate you all. Give it one more minute and then we will look at the Grant County protocol. Okay, so let me pull the protocol up. Here we go. Can folks see the, it says SART at the very top?
I can see it, but I will wait for Yep, okay, we got one yes.
Okay, awesome. Should be good to go. So
Yeses.
since we came out with this, a number of counties have asked us to, if we can share the protocol. And the reason we don't just hand it off is because it was really a process with the Grant County SART to talk through what they were seeing and what they needed. And it's going to be individual to each community. And the biggest piece being that this is not going to be effective if individual members don't have training around human trafficking. And so you can see we like right at the outset, we say this document is not meant to take the place of comprehensive training on the topic, and we let them know where they can get more training. But this first piece, you can see we've listed the folks who contributed to it. So it was a collaborative effort between our office, Indiana Trafficking Victims Assistance Program, Indiana Protection for Abuse and Trafficked Humans Task Force, our law enforcement committee, which is now our law enforcement operations team, Indiana Legal Services, DCS, and for them, it was the U.S. Attorney's Office for the Northern District of Indiana. So depending on which area you're in, that could end up being the U.S. Attorney's Office for the Southern District of Indiana. So just to run through the parts, we did put general indicators of human trafficking in the beginning because they did ask us for this. The plan was for them to roll it out countywide with all law enforcement departments and as well as other stakeholders on their SART. And so we did include it, but we were very clear that again, this doesn't take the place of training because if you just have these indicators and you don't understand any other background pieces, it's a lot harder to respond appropriately. At the same time, we recognize not every law enforcement officer in the state was going to get training right away. And so we still wanted to be able to roll it out. So this was kind of our compromise. So you have those common sex trafficking indicators, common labor trafficking indicators, and then we get into the protocol itself. And so we approach this as let's take each main role on a SART and break it down for them what they would do in their position if they think they're coming across it. So for law enforcement, the very first question is always, is the person in immediate danger? Follow standard protocol. But then outside of that, we said, are you dealing with a minor or are you dealing with an adult? And what's the call that you make depending on which one it is? And we broke down those resources. So Indiana Youth Services Association, they oversee the Indiana Trafficking Victims Assistance Program, and I've included them in the resources. They provide free trainings around the state, and they also provide services to youth up to 24. And so even if a case can't be screened in by the hotline, but it for whatever reason, because maybe, that area DCS is still getting trained, they didn't recognize it, or they need more information. A minor can still be potentially connected with resources through the ITVAP program, which is why we've included them in here. We're talking about an adult. You can see Hands of Hope is the initial contact if they want help, because that's the Rape Crisis Center and the main victim service provider on their team. And then we have the national hotline, and we talk about still providing resources even if they don't want help, because they might at some point. They ask that we include a contact for if somebody's having a mental health crisis, because they actually have a team in that area for that. And then again, because it's law enforcement, we have a number of general things in here that we include about investigations. The prosecutor always wanted to be notified. Connecting with IPAF's law enforcement coordinator for assistance. Knowing who to contact at the U.S. Attorney's Office. Again, depending on the region, that could be the Southern District. Knowing, if you're getting the Department of Homeland Security involved, rather than just reaching out to them, with a general federal contact, we have designated agents in Indiana that handle those cases. And then again, making sure they're reporting to the Attorney General's office. We include what to do if they're coming across a foreign national. So making sure they're engaging an interpreter and how they can do that, calling the national hotline, in that declaration of law enforcement officer form that we talked about. For prosecutors, and I think I can drop this in the chat since I know some of you are from prosecutor offices. In addition to, that reminder about connecting victims with an advocate, IPAC and the 2 U.S. attorneys' offices in Indiana a couple of years ago created these prosecutorial considerations in trafficking cases, which we share whenever we get the opportunity. So the I think after I stop sharing, I'll drop that in the chat. That might be a little bit easier. It's also attached as an addendum to their protocol. Who to call at IPAC if you have a general question, and where they can get some additional training. And then we break down the difference between community-based and systems-based advocates, since systems-based advocates have some limitations that community-based advocates don't. So that's law enforcement, that's prosecutors, and we move on to the victim service provider. Again, in this case, the one at the table for their county was Hands of Hope. And so making sure they're aware of those additional rights that we talked about, what to do if, it's an adult and they don't want to report to law enforcement, or they do, who to call. And again, for an adult, this is hard for law enforcement, but, emphasizing if they're an adult and they don't want to report, they don't have to. That's their choice. The hope is that we can, with the right support, we can get them to that place, but that's, again, still their choice. How to get their needs met depending on what it is they need. Again, same, breaking down if they're foreign born, where they can get help. For healthcare, obviously, always following HIPAA. What to do if somebody's accompanying the victim, and in this case, a patient, knowing that the trafficker could be with them and how they deal with that, giving some guidance around that. Again, we break down for them, what to do if it's a minor versus an adult. And then DCS, again, this is, we realize a lot of SARTs have DCS on their team, but if we're talking about a case involving just minors, that's something we always encourage folks to run through their local child advocacy center team. And if you don't know this, DCS actually has human trafficking leads throughout the state. And so when the hotline is called, they can connect to the human trafficking lead or forward the information. They don't do it in the very moment, but they can forward any reports to the lead in the respective areas. And then just some general information for everybody on the team. Again, working with the local CAC, making sure that they have training, what to do if you're encountering a potential endangered adult. And so, some information about adult protective services, guardianship services, and FSSA's Division of Disability Services. We break down generally what a rape crisis center can provide, because we discovered law enforcement doesn't always know this information and tries to find resources on their own. And we always tell them the nice part is that that burden's not on them. They don't have to figure out that part, just get them to the service provider and they can take it from there. And then confidentiality, and this is something that teams have to work through all the time anyway, but understanding that service providers cannot, give information on somebody without a release of information. So then we added lines for signatures, because again, the prosecutor wanted to roll it out with all police departments in the county, and we have healthcare in the county, the folks on the SART, even they included their local campus police for Taylor University, and I think this is Indiana Wesleyan University up there. We've got all applicable statutes related to trafficking attached to this. And then I'll just kind of show you really quick. I'm going to try and drop it in the chat separately. Sorry about that, folks. Keep scrolling through, and now I'm getting all the notifications. So thank you for responding on the survey. This is the document that was created by IPAC and the two U.S. attorney's offices, these prosecutorial considerations. So it's really helpful, and it's got some national resources in here and breaking down things that you might encounter on a case, which is really helpful. So with all of that being said, I'm going to stop sharing there. We're getting close to the end of our time here, but any questions about the protocol development? And I will say this was done over, it wasn't like we met with them once, we drafted it the next week and handed it off. It was several months process, multiple meetings with them, talking through what they were seeing, what they needed, who we should or shouldn't include in the protocol, and the best way to word that. And then having a lot of conversations around making sure that team members and their departments got trained on trafficking, so everybody was on the same page. And get this up in the chat. While I'm putting this in the chat, any questions around that? Or resources or anything in general? There was a lot of information I put out at once. Does anyone have questions about or have thoughts about how that process might work in their individual county or area? All right. Okay. Just drop the prosecutorial considerations in the chat for prosecutors if you want to download that. And while you're thinking, if you have any questions or comments, I'm going to go back into the PowerPoint just to show you some other resources. Is everyone seeing the PowerPoint? Marissa, maybe you can let me know if you see it on your screen.
Yes, I'm seeing
Okay.
it.
Okay. So I have some additional resources. The first one up there is obviously our agency, but the first thing that's really helpful if you are just starting a SART, or maybe you have one and you're still kind of in the beginning pieces of formation, we actually have a whole toolkit on SART formation. And so you all should know Alexis Moore from our agency. She normally runs these meetings and she is the SART point person. And so she's a phenomenal resource in helping people, with their initial protocol. So it's helpful to make sure that you have that initial protocol for a SART in general before you leap to human trafficking protocol, because you want to make sure you already have that basic understanding of how you're responding as a team before you add in human trafficking, which is more specialized cases. And so Alexis is great for that. And we have a toolkit on our website. And then if you need technical assistance, maybe a case comes up in the meantime, you want to talk about it, not sure what to do, you need more resources, you can reach out to me. My email's at the end, or also just send it to info@ICASHT, and that'll come to us. Again, Indiana Trafficking Victims Assistance Program. They have free training, services for youth up to 24. And so they have a law enforcement specific training they do in partnership with Indiana State Police. They have a healthcare specific training. They partner with DCS to do a DCS training. So if you need those resources, they have youth worker trainings. If you need those resources, they have got them and they can hook you up. Also, Marissa, do you want to just talk really quickly about the Rape Crisis Center training that you do?
Yeah, so this is something we launched launched a few years ago. Right now, we have 11 of the 16 rape crisis centers have received the training, so that's really exciting. Basically, part one is similar information that was presented today, just an overview of human trafficking with a clinical focus. So, serving survivors and providing context for working with survivors as well. And then the second part is really more of an activity and supporting your agency in thinking about different policies and resource mapping in your community. So, making sure that you don't feel isolated. And if you feel like you are in your community, sort of brainstorming, can you access services outside of your community? What is necessary in kind of that multidisciplinary way to support the survivors? So, I would love to engage with you, even if your agency is a sexual assault service provider or you provide advocacy really in any way. We can discuss the possibility of that training. So yeah, you can email me at I'll put my email in the chat here. So yeah, would love to engage.
Thank you. So yeah, definitely reach out to Marissa if you're a service provider, or you have service providers in your area that work with adults. She can talk to them about possible training. And then I've included National Sexual Violence Resource Center that includes information about human trafficking for SARTs. And the National Survivor Study, where I had that initial stat about 96% of survivors as adults say that they had some type of abuse in childhood. You can get way more detailed information by going to the report here. I will I will have Alexis send out a PDF of this presentation, so you will get the slides for this and have my information. And I think we got the whole thing in. So yeah, we still have some time for questions, answers, any discussion you want to have around this. And oh, thank you, Lisa. So wasn't sure if she was still here. So Lisa Aisher is the statewide service provider support director at the Indiana Trafficking Victims Assistance Program. I had asked her, well, I had sent her the information for today because she wanted to see the training, but also it's great that she's here so you can connect with her if you have questions about trainings or their network of service providers. They have a whole network that they contract with around the state, again, to serve youth up to 24. So if you want to know who those providers are or find out who's in your region, please reach out to Lisa. She would be a great resource for that. Lisa, am I missing anything about you all?
No, I think you got it. I will say that you can get on there and get the email address for the coalition leader in your area rather than calling the phone number and asking to be connected. If you just want to save a step, their emails are all listed. I'm not sure if my information is on the website yet. I just started July 1st, so it will be soon. But we do contract with service providers, and sometimes that's helpful in adding more service providers, right? If there's some training that's going along with it, so you know that they're prepared for specifically for this population of trafficking survivors. And yeah, we want to be here to help. So as Karen said, Karen, this is great training. Thank you for allowing me to watch or to join in. But also, yeah, please do reach out if there's anything we can help you with. We are serving the entire state as well.
Thanks, Lisa. I appreciate that. And I'm glad you're able to sit in today. I think what Lisa was referencing. So yeah, if you go on maybe you can drop it in the chat, Lisa. If you go on IFAP's website, where they list the regional contacts, you can find a local, regional coalition coordinator in your area. And the nice thing about them is they're based locally, so they're really knowledgeable about who's doing the work in those areas and individual stakeholders. So what she was referencing in the Grant County, and I think this is what you were looking at, Lisa, in the Grant County protocol. I'm glad you brought this up. So we had in there to contact, when you're contacting it, that we had like a general phone number for IYSA. And the reason for that, when we talked it through with Grant County, they didn't want to have in the main protocol, they didn't want to have individual names and contacts in the event that people changed and then have to change the protocol constantly. So I forgot to mention this. We actually gave them a separate contact sheet with all of the relevant contacts. So the Homeland Security agents in their area, their names and their contact information, their local IPVAP coalition coordinator, how they can reach their human trafficking lead. All of those things are in a separate contact sheet that they're going to try and update once a year. But we try to keep it really general in the protocol. So that's why it looked like that. But yeah, thanks
That's
for
what- yeah.
mentioning that.
That's
helpful.
actually a great plan. I can see on our contact page that Chrissy for Region 6 is still listed and she's no longer there. And Sheila will not be there after September 30th. So there will be some change. So it may be wise to reach out to a program director, or Karen will be up to date on who's here and who's not, and I'll be up to date on who's here and who's not. So feel free to use my email address and I can get you directed.
Yeah, you get to one of us, we'll get you to the right person. So we generally all work together on that. We have a really great partnership with IPVAP, and we're super grateful for the work that they do. All right, any questions, thoughts, issues that people are having in their area? Trying to get up to speed on trafficking, or any other resources we didn't talk about that you think that you might need? All are a very quiet group. Hey, well, I don't, I'll stay on a few more minutes. For anyone who wants to chat separately, but otherwise, I think we're done. So I know Kelly had started the meeting. I think she had to jump out, and Alexis is elsewhere today. So if you need to leave, that's totally fine. And I will just wait until 11:30 if anyone else wants to chat. But thank you so much for being here today. We really appreciate it.
Okay, so I'll go ahead and see if I can, yeah, I can stop the recording.
Okay, cool. Thank you. I think we just have a note